What does mono versus stereo reverb sound like? And how can we use mono reverbs to improve the mono compatibility of our ambient mixes? Hey, it's Marcus from Holosuite. In my previous video, I talked a bit about using mono reverbs instead of stereo reverbs, and also a few different things about narrowing reverbs to make sure that they're more mono compatible. So in this video, I thought I might go in a little bit more depth about how it works between mono reverbs and stereo reverbs, and how we can use mono reverbs to get the same kind of sound as a stereo reverb, but without having to worry about it phasing. Now, before I get into it, I'll just do a quick shout out to my links in the description. Firstly, you'll find a link to a bunch of free resources that I've crafted specifically for experimental and ambient musicians to improve their mixes and masters. So please do check them out if you're interested. And also there's a link where you can either ask me a question or request a free master sample from me. That's all in the description. Check them out when you've got a chance. All right, let's get to the good stuff. So today I'm going to be looking at 4 different ways to look at reverbs. Reverbs are one of the biggest problems with phase issues and mono compatibility in ambient music. So I'm going to have a look at different ways that we can try to mitigate those phasing effects of reverbs. And I've set up 4 different instances here of exactly the same reverb. I'm going to go through them and compare what they sound like, what their weaknesses might be, and which ones might be the most appropriate in certain situations. So let's start off with the full width stereo. So here I have Valhalla Supermassive. I've set it to the billions and billions preset, my favorite, and I've set the width to 100%. So this is a big reverb. This is probably the one that you will associate the most with, like, that kind of ambient sound. So let's have a quick listen. Okay, big and lush, right? Feels like it's all the way out there. But what I want to look at here is what it looks like in a coralometer, what it looks like in terms of its phase. Now I'm using the Ozone 11 imager, not the one that I usually show, just because it's easier to see when things are going kind of out of phase, right? Into that kind of anti-phase territory. Red is anti-phase, right? So what this means is that if we flick this to mono now, you can kind of hear that phasing happening in the mids. Let's go back. All right, just listen in that mids area. It's kind of things are coming in and out. And also a lot of the top end seems to be disappearing. Right, so this is what happens when you use a reverb that's too wide, that if you're listening to it in less than ideal, listening situations, then that's the kind of thing that you might hear, right? So obviously, even though it sounds amazing, we want to try and find some way to get a better version of it so that we can still get that lovely reverb sound, but we want to make sure that it's going to be, relatively mono compatible. It's going to sound okay if you switch it to mono. So the first way we can look at it is basically just to reduce the width of the reverb. So in this case here, I'll just solo that. I've got the same version of Valhalla, and all the settings are exactly the same, but what I've done is I've reduced the width down to 56.8%, so about half of what it was before. So let's have a quick listen. If we compare that to the full width, okay, so this one's kind of further out there. Feels kind of richer maybe. This one feels a little bit closer in and not as, it doesn't have that same kind of vibe to it, right? But if we go over to our imager, we'll see that it's looking great here. And then if we flick the whole thing to mono and then compare the narrowed reverb against the bigger reverb, we'll start to hear some differences. So this is the narrowed reverb, mono. And this is the full width stereo. So I'll flick back kind of quickly a couple of times so you can hear that. Narrowed, full width. Narrowed, full width. Do you hear that the narrow one has preserved more of the top end? Interestingly. So there's the narrow version again. And then the full width is kind of losing that top end. So this is the effect of the phase cancellation. The phase, obviously there's some kind of phase cancellation happening in that top end. When it's set to that narrower, when it's set internally to be narrower, it seems to be fixing that problem, right? So obviously, while we might prefer the sound of the full width stereo, we're making a compromise for that mono, listening situation. So this is something we need to think about as we're working. So for example, we could pull in a EQ and we could start to try and get the same kind of sound, at least in a mono situation. So if I switch this as mono, and then I can flick back and forth and try and get a similar kind of EQ for both of them. So it won't be perfect, but sounding a lot closer now, right? So that's just some small things. One thing to note, when I was messing around with this, I tried to do it in mid-side mode, and I realized that the more you cut out of the mids, the wider the mix becomes, and therefore you end up going into antiphase territory again. So I recommend, if you're doing something like this, try and keep it in like standard stereo mode. Don't try doing this in mid-side, because you'll end up accidentally causing the same problems that you're trying to fix. Right. So obviously that's great. There is another way, which is an absolute surefire method of getting our reverb to be perfectly mono compatible, and that's to make the reverb mono. So I'm just going to switch this out of mono here. So here I've got 2 copies of Valhalla Supermassive. Once again, these have been reduced completely to 0% width. So they are mono reverbs. I've got one that's panned 40 left. I've got one that's panned 40 right. Let's listen to what that sounds like. Okay. Let's listen to that compared to the full width stereo. All right, very, very different. But if we switch to mono and then listen to them again. So this is dual mono, but set to mono. There's a slight volume difference there, but it's not a huge difference, right? So obviously here we're prioritizing the mono experience, and so it's not going to sound fantastic if you're just listening to the reverb itself in mono. But one of the things that I noticed when I was doing this is that it seems to remove some of that internal kind of phasing sound. So even though the dual monos have got exactly the same settings on the left and the right, they don't have that same kind of weird phasey sound to them when we're playing them at the same time. So I'll just quickly play them again. All right. And then quickly over to the stereo full width again. So there's this kind of, I don't know, like a tearing sound almost in the mids that happens in the full width stereo that's not happening in the mono one. So you end up with a kind of a cleaner reverb sound in that mono situation. And the same here, we can, EQ out the bits that we don't want so that it sounds more like that full width stereo. But what we are going to get is a perfectly mono compatible mix if the reverb is the only thing that's causing the problem. The last thing I wanted to show you is that there are 2 ways to mono your reverb. And I've discovered that they're actually slightly different from each other. So in here, I have done this internally. So I've adjusted the width. So I've adjusted the width to 0% inside Valhalla Supermassive. But there's also the other way to do it, which is you take Valhalla Supermassive and you have it set to 100% width. So 2 copies, 1 pan left, 1 pan right. And then we add a utility plugin where the mono has been activated, which will make both of these individually mono. So we get a fully mono reverb. And you would think that they'd sound exactly the same because they're both using the same method at the end. They are both becoming mono in the left and right channels. But strangely, they are slightly different. So this is internal. Let's turn that off. This is internal. And this is using the utility plugin. So I'll just quickly flick back before them. So internal, utility, internal, utility. So somewhere in the upper mids, it's feeling a little bit scooped in the utility version. So internal's got just a little bit more action happening in that kind of upper mids area. Utility seems to be missing it. My guess is because these ones here might have experienced some phase cancellation because they had been internally quite wide, the mono has then baked in that phase cancellation into the resulting reverb sound. But when we're doing it internally, because it's already narrow to begin with, it's not having that internal phase. So the last thing that I'll mention is just something interesting I found when I was doing the dual mono. So if I have one here, pan 40 left, one here, pan 40 right, let's say I turn one of them off and I look at them through my imager here. Okay, so I can see it's panned exactly 40 to the left. Pretty cool, huh? And then if I do the same thing over here, I've got 40 right. Pretty cool, exactly the same thing. But if I switch them both on at the same time, it goes dead down the center. Isn't that interesting? And the other thing to note while I'm here is that let's say I have two mono reverbs, but I put them directly on top of each other. And then I play. Now I'll start moving them to the left and right. So if I press mono now, it's just interesting to hear what happens when you move things around. Even in the mono space, it does have a strange effect. So it's technically stereo, but when you're moving two mono things around, they affect each other in interesting ways as you pan them around. I found that when I had them at the exact center, it kind of felt a little bit phasey-ish maybe. But if I move them out to the sides, feels like it's a good bit more breathing room. That could just be me. Anyway, I hope this is helpful. It's a lot of different ways to think about reverb. I think one of the problems that happens a lot in ambient music is that people get really addicted to that kind of hollowed out sound where everything's pushed all the way out to the sides. But the problem with that is that it makes it very hard to mix really well. Whereas if you've got mono reverbs, you've got a lot of flexibility to do things with EQ, move them around the stereo field. There really is a lot more that you can do. And don't forget that you can even add more interest by doing things like changing the settings of one of those two mono reverbs so that you get a little bit of a contrast between left and right. I mean, you can even move them around. I tend to use panning and stuff like that to move them around. Lots of fun things that you can do with mono reverbs or less than super wide stereo reverbs. So next time you're making a track, just try this out and see if you can get yourself in a good spot where everything's perfectly mono compatible, but it still sounds just as good. Thank you so much for watching as always. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel. You'll be supporting one of the very few channels out there that is giving you specific and actionable tips on how to mix and master experimental music. Don't forget to check the links in the description if you haven't already. And over here, I'll put my previous video where I talked about mono compatibility for ambient music. Until next time, keep making music. Cheers.